The Ukrainian armed force was the largest, best equipped, and best trained NATO army that has ever been fielded. Man for man, it was better than the American armed forces, and that's the truth. They're certainly better motivated because, after all, the Ukrainian soldiers, well, they're defending their own land from the Russian invaders. So they're better trained, better equipped, and more motivated. And they have been annihilated. What do you think will happen to Lithuanian troops, Polish troops, or American troops that go up against the Russians? They're going to be annihilated too. They're going to annihilate the Americans. And this is where the danger comes in. I don't care how much you love the American flag. I don't care how much you say that America #1 and best equipped army and all that bullshit. The fact is they're going to be annihilated by the Russians like that. And after, the Biden administration, out of panic and out of a cavalier attitude that it's no big deal, they are going to use nuclear weapons. They are going to do that.
This was always inevitable. In any world where the United States is no longer banning war and is no longer regulating commerce in the way that we did during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, the Russians were always going to go out and try to resecure what they see as the gateway invasion access corridors, places like the Polish Plain, the Bessarabian Gap, the Baltic Sea. They were always going to try to do this. What has changed is that the Russians are literally dying out. And the post-Cold War generation that was born through the 1990s was so small that the Russians were losing the capacity to field a regular army. So if they didn't do it now, they would lose the possibility, and they would be then unanchored in this kind of great open flat zone in the middle of Eurasia. And the next time there's a war, they couldn't stop it. So they're hoping to forward position what they've got left in these gaps. And Ukraine, unfortunately, is between them and two of the most important gaps. So it's not just that they're going for Ukraine. They're going for Moldova. They're going for parts of Romania and Poland and all of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. It's just a question of timing. But Ukraine is the flavor of the month. I kind of see this war as the last conflict of the Cold War, because as long as the Russians existed, their security was going to drive their decision making. So it's kind of like how the Civil War was the final war of the American Revolution. We're kind of at the end of this section of history now.
When you think about what's happening kind of on the ground, and of course, I always am careful to say, like, we don't really know what's happening, but we can just go off of the reports that we're getting.
Sure.
It seems like Russia may have thought that they would be able to be successful in Ukraine much quicker than they have been. So I think they've been a little surprised by the resistance that they faced. And also it appears that they may have thought that China or other countries were going to have much more support for them than it appears that they do. Is that a fair categorization in terms of maybe some assumptions that Russia had going into it, and they've been surprised by the lack of success or support that they've received?
Absolutely. One of the things we've seen in a lot of the authoritarian governments that are in existence right now, most notably Russia and China, is that their leadership has completely isolated themselves from the rest of the world. And so if you are in Putin's inner circle, you don't dare give him bad news because he will kill you. So there were a lot of assumptions that were made in the Kremlin that just have turned out to not be true. Now, in all due defense to Putin and the Kremlin, everyone in the West was thinking the same way. We never thought that the Europeans would pull together in the way that they did. We never thought that we would get any sort of meaningful international sanctions that included countries like Japan and Korea. We thought that the Ukrainians would crumble. We thought that the war would be over in a month. Everyone has gotten it wrong. But from my point of view, the single biggest flaw is the complete collapse institutionally of the Russian military. They are making mistakes that were worse than what the Iraqis did in 1992 or what they themselves did during the Chechen wars. Just the inability of them to launch any sort of meaningful multi-domain operation in what we thought of as the second most advanced military in the world is just blows your mind and forces the Russians now to do siege mentality tactics where they just obliterate civilian infrastructure because now that's the only way they can win the war.
When you start to think about the participation of NATO allies in this conflict, there still is no no-fly zone. there still is, at least officially, no troops on the ground from those NATO allies. But there seems to be quite a bit of flowing of both capital and weaponry to Ukrainian forces. How is that helping? Would they not be able to provide this resistance without that? And I guess kind of how important is it that the European countries came together along with the United States to provide the support to Ukraine?
Well, I don't have a good answer for you for how the Europeans came together, because no one, even in Europe, anticipated this level of support. And everyone is taking any weapon system that they can that doesn't require a static footprint, so no jets, because that requires an airport or an airfield. But anything that can be carried or moved by truck that is not nailed down is being shipped in. And the reason originally was they wanted to give the Ukrainians a fighting chance. But I think it was the convoy that was north of Kiev, the 40-mile long one, that terrified Western leaders. Because we had this 40-mile convoy with thousands of vehicles that stalled out in a day because of lack of fuel, just horrible logistics. And then 2 days later, they ran out of food. And so all the soldiers had to get out and walk back to Belarus, just leaving their vehicles behind. Well, from a certain point of view, that's yay, the Russians are incompetent. But until you realize that if there ever was a direct conflict between Western and especially American forces and Russian forces on the battlefield, the Russians would be obliterated. That's a bad thing, because it means that if Russia pushes through and captures all of Ukraine and then moves to its next stages, which are those gaps in Romania and Poland, for example, there will be a direct fight, and the Russians would be obliterated. And they would then face a simple choice. Do we go into a humiliating strategic withdrawal from which this country will never recover, or do we up the ante to include nukes? And so once that issue kind of sank in the White House and DOD, now we are almost desperate to send any possible weapon systems that we can. So in April, this war is going to be incredibly bloody, because when the war started, the Ukrainians only had a few hundred Javelin anti-tank launchers, and they only had a few dozen Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Well, that was before the Americans started supplying things in bulk. They're only now starting to arrive. So we're talking about the Russians suffering tank and air attrition at an order of magnitude higher than they are right now. And this has gone from an issue, well, we need to slow the Russians and extract a cost, but we know we can't win, to if we don't win, we are really risking a nuclear conflict. So we have to do everything we can short of regular direct intervention to crush the entire Russian system as quickly as possible. So Ukraine is now the field upon which this will all be determined.